Hey guys, so my name is Morgan and I'm going to be talking about why the Union won the Civil War today. But before I get started, I just wanted to warn you that my dog can't seem to leave my side today, so if he just pops up in the video, just don't be alarmed. So why the Union won the Civil War? So we all know that the Civil War was started by the idea of slavery and that some people believed in it and some did not. The war also began because of the differences the Union and the South had for the economics of slavery. So, expanding westward would mean that slavery would spread across America, and the Union didn't want that, and they wouldn't let that happen. And having Abraham Lincoln be elected president helped the Union gain power, as there were no southern states that voted for him, but he still won. So when the South realized that they had no more power, they decided to secede, which seemed to be the only solution they could come up with. And this enraged the North, and the war began after the North thought that the South was wrong to leave the Union. So when the war started, it was practically brother against brother. Everybody was fighting. Everybody from different families. It just depended on what they believed in, whether they believed in slavery or they didn't. So the North, from the beginning, had more of an advantage over the South. On page 468 to 469, it says the Union had 23 states, including 4 border slave states, while the Confederacy had 11 states. The population was about 22 million in the Union and 9 million in the Confederacy. And out of this 9 million, 3.5 million of those were enslaved African Americans. So the South had way less people than the North. The only advantage the South really had was they knew the land better than the Union did, because they were literally fighting in their home. Like, this is where they were from, so they knew the ins and outs of where they were fighting. And the South also had more experienced military leaders. So, like I said, they knew the ins and outs of the land and knew how to use it to help them. The North had more soldiers who were better trained and better weapons. Since the North had already started on the factory aspect of their economy, they were one step ahead of the South, and it seemed to be that they were one step ahead of the South throughout practically the entire war. The Union had stronger everything. They had better transportation and more supplies, which included ammunition and food and just basic war materials that they would need to win the war. The North also had control over the railroad and shipping transportation, so this also weakened the South. The South had a group of men who came through and destroyed the railroads, which actually really did hurt them, which was called Sherman's March to the Sea. And on page 500 to 501, it says, in November of 1864, Sherman's army began its fabled march to the sea, advancing rapidly through Georgia, where no organized Confederate armies remained. And Sherman was a Northern general, so it wasn't Grant at this time. He planned to, in quotes, whip the rebels to humble their pride, to follow them into their inmost recesses, and make them fear and dread us. So basically, the Union Army devastating march, that was the devastating march through Georgia from Atlanta to Savannah, led by William T. Sherman, intended to demoralize civilians and destroy the resources the Confederate Army needed to fight. And since the North already had more of an advantage with the railroad system, this kind of just was beating a dead horse at this point. The South had a younger troop selection, as fighting for the South during the war was what every young man was expected to do for their family. They pretty much, during the war, as soon as they reached a certain age, they were part of the war. And they were basically told just to get out there and kill as many as you can without getting hurt themselves. So the South also had their slaves fighting against them as they started to rebel or even go fight with the North to strengthen the northern side during the war, giving the South something else to take care of in the midst of the war. They pretty much, they had to expect the slaves were going to rebel against them, but I'll talk a little bit more about slave rebellions in a few minutes. To win the war, Grant knew that he had to take control and make sure the South didn't expand west across the Mississippi River. So, I mean, if the South were to expand westward, then, I mean, slavery would too, and that was not what the North wanted. So, the Battle of Vicksburg prevented this from happening as the Union won the battle. So, this prevented the South from moving west. So, on page 493, it talks about Vicksburg, and it says, in the Battle of Vicksburg, Grant decided to wear down the encircled Confederates through constant bombardment and gradual starvation. The rebel soldiers and the city's residents were hopelessly trapped. They could neither escape nor be reinforced nor resupplied with food or ammunition. As the weeks passed, the besieged Confederates ate their horses and mules, then dogs and cats, and finally rats. The Confederate commander at Vicksburg wrote Jefferson Davis that the situation was hopeless. A group of soldiers pleaded with their commander, if you can't feed us, you had better surrender us, horrible as that idea was. So, I mean, it pretty much seems like the Battle of Vicksburg was pretty, like, gross and inhuman because, like, the South was pretty much forced to literally use what they had, which was already nothing. So, I mean, they pretty much were mad at Jefferson Davis that he was even making them do this. Like, this was insane. So, he had to stop the South from producing any more of the materials they needed for their weapons or other necessities. And the Confederacy had a strategy in mind to gain more supplies, but it fell through. So, on page 471, it talks about the Confederate representatives in Paris won a promise from France to recognize the Confederacy as a new nation, only if Great Britain would do the same. But the British Prime Minister refused to work with the Confederates, partly in response to pressure from President Lincoln, and partly out of Britain's desire to maintain its trade with the United States. So as it turned out, however, the British, although eventually losing 400,000 jobs in their textile mills, they were able to import enough cotton from their Asian colony, India, which was called India, to maintain production of cloth. So in the end, Confederate diplomacy in Europe was more successful in getting military supplies than gaining official recognition of the Confederacy as an independent nation. So, like the Union, the South was pretty much taken like as a joke, like to other countries, including like America. Like they couldn't possibly think that they were actually going to become like another like respectful nation. So Grant changed the Union strategy for the better, which he, like it says on page 499, Grant's usual strategy was to find out where the enemy is, get to him as soon as you can, and strike him as hard as you can, and keep moving on. And he pretty much realized that this strategy wasn't going to work with the experienced Southern generals, so he changed his strategy by planning for the three largest Union armies, which he placed one in Virginia, one in Tennessee, and one in Louisiana, to launch offensives in the spring of 1864, so in which the fighting would never cease. So his plan was he wanted to have no more short battles and just have big ones in hopes of wearing the Confederates out. So fighting the war on the Confederate States' homeland took a toll on the South. Everything they owned and worked for was gone because of the war. They had these huge plantations that the slaves worked on, and they were all, destroyed because of the fighting and the war. The way the war was financed was both different on both sides, as they had two different economy types. On page 490, it talks about the South made their living and funded the war by how they lived on their farms. And with that destroyed, they had to find a new way. So they financed the war by taxation, currency troubles, soaring inflation, and social unrest. So the way they made their living was demolished, When the South's General Robert E. Lee tried to make an attempt to receive more supplies for his troops from the North, the Battle of Gettysburg took place, leaving the South in more suffering. And the North had won the battles in Vicksburg, Gettysburg, and Chattanooga, which gave the Union a victory when the South lost the war in the West. Chattanooga did that. But Gettysburg, like when they were trying to like secretly like get more supplies from the North, this is when like Grant took advantage, and like the whole Gettysburg battle took place, and it was not good. But going back to Chattanooga, since we talked about Vicksburg and Gettysburg, Chattanooga gave the Union a victory when the South lost the war in the West. So this stopped westward expansion too, and that was talked about on page 496. So Chattanooga, like pretty much, like Gettysburg was considered like the turning point of the war, but Chattanooga pretty much like dug the nail in the coffin. Like they pretty much were done. They pretty much had no chance for a comeback. And on page 497, Robert E. Lee kind of knew the war was practically over, but he didn't want to like let his troops know, because that would, take their confidence away, even though they were already like drained and so tired from fighting. So Robert E. Lee knew that the war was practically over and he had lost, so he offered his resignation to Jefferson Davis, but it was refused. And Jefferson Davis told Lee that he could not find a better commander. So Lee was pretty much like all Jefferson Davis had. Like he was like, that was it. Like he had no one else. So this, a little bit more about Gettysburg. Many people considered the battle the turning point, like I said, since this is when like the South began to lose, because the South lost so many troops at this battle. It wasn't a surprise when the Union got the South to surrender, because the South was left with nothing. They were bankrupt with no way of making a comeback in the economy without some help. So after the official surrender at Appomattox, this marked the end of the Civil War. So Robert E. Lee had no other choice after the different battles of the war had caused him to abandon his Confederate capital in Richmond. So Lee had nowhere to call his safe headquarters to come up with more strategies. So, after like Richmond, they didn't really have, like, they set up camp everywhere, but they didn't really have like a set place to like call home. So on page 469, it talks about like the capturing of Richmond, and it says capturing Richmond was what everyone wanted from the North. Lincoln hoped that the Union Army would overrun the outnumbered Confederates and quickly push on to Richmond, which was only 107 miles south of where they were in Northern Virginia at Manassas Junction, which was like a big railroad crossing. This eventually led to the surrender as well. So, me personally, I grew up like in a small like southern town, and it pretty much, like where I live, like it took place, like the Civil War took place like all around me. Like I live in Louisa, which it's right in the middle of where the war happened. And then like my parents are from Spotsylvania, so Spotsylvania was like a big part of the war. And currently, I actually just moved in to like Lake Wilderness area. So the battle like of the like wilderness was actually part of the Civil War too. So like the Civil War was always like a major topic in all of my social studies and history classes. Like it's a big deal like here. And there's always a field trip to go to the different battlegrounds whenever the topic of the Civil War comes up within the school year. I mean, I've been to and seen signs for countless like battles of the Civil War. I mean, there's still like trenches everywhere. There's cannons on all the parks. Like, there's still some houses still standing. I mean, it's like pretty preserved, which is kind of neat. I mean, it's nothing to drive down the road and see signs marking the place of different significant things that happened during the Civil War, or see like the actual battlegrounds. So Chancellorsville, I kind of will talk about that because I mean that's where I live right now. The battleground, it's like literally my backyard. Like, you look outside and you see like the signs for the park battleground. It was actually a very large battle in the war and caused many casualties. Like, it's not really talked about as much as Gettysburg, but it is like up there beside it because of the amount of casualties it had. It was a very large battle in the war and caused many casualties for the North, giving the South more power in the battle. But then, like, July came and Gettysburg turned that around. And it actually talks about Chancellorsville on page 492 in the textbook, and it says, Chancellorsville was after the Union disaster at Fredericksburg at the end of 1862, and Lincoln turned to General Joseph Hooker, who was nicknamed Fighting Joe, for his fierceness and like his like determination to fight and to win. General Hooker had over 130,000 men, which was the largest Union army yet gathered, and he had like a brilliant plan, but he was very overconfident, so his failed leadership like resulted in the loss. And I mean, there's trenches and cannons like literally right in like 10 feet out my back door. But I mean, we're reminded every day like of the Civil War in our everyday lives. Like, it's not really like gone yet. So I mean, it was a huge part in history. So summed up, the Union pretty much won the Civil War because they had an advantage from the beginning. I mean, they had a 22 million to 9 million population over the South. The North had 93% of the nation's manufactured goods, 97% of the nation's firearms, and 96% of the nation's railroad equipment, while the South only had 7% of the nation's manufactured goods. The North also had the nation's financial center, in which banking reforms during the war allowed the Union to sell $2 billion in bonds to private investors and print $450 million in paper money. And the South was land rich but cash poor, and they struggled to raise revenue to support the war, printing over $1 billion in paper currency without backing up revenue collection or bonds, and that resulted in rampant inflation. The North's geography secured the Union's border states, giving the Union troops greater access to rivers on which to launch their invasions. And the South had a home field advantage since most of the war was fought in the South and they had support from the civilian population. They also challenged the Union by having this much land because it made it harder for the Union to capture it. The North also had the Militia Act of 1862, which authorized African American enlistment into the Union Army, and some 180,000 served, which was over 80% in the South. And the South had more than 30% of the population, or 1.5 million, were slaves at the start of the Civil War. So then the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 damaged Southern economy and encouraged slaves to run away, enlist with the Union, or passively resist in the South. It eliminated chance of European power, such as England and France, becoming a Confederate military ally. And finally, the North's leadership was backed up by President Lincoln as he favored the generals such as Grant and Sherman, and they both developed the total war strategy that defeated Confederate forces in the West and eventually subdued the Confederate rebellion. The South had President Davis, who was unable to maintain political support or public confidence. The South started with superior military leaders, but many were killed throughout the war. And Southern governors asserted states' rights and resisted Davis's efforts to centralize power and drive the war effort. So, with all that summed up too, the North pretty much just had more advantages over the South from the beginning and took action when they needed to win the war. So, that's my oral presentation, and now I have to go see what my dog is chewing up. So, thanks for watching.